We've been studying the book of Romans for the past 12 weeks. In chapter 1, we saw that knowledge of God's existence is actually built into us. So we're without excuse. We know God's there. Chapter 2 added the fact that the righteous requirements of the law are actually written on our hearts. So that adds to that thought. We talked about righteousness and justice, or justification, faith, how the sin of Adam not only deeply impacted all of us, but it actually impacted creation itself. We talked about the slavery to sin and the law. Then I covered chapter 8, which is actually kind of the center of Romans, and I mean that literally. It's chapter 8 of 16, but also theologically, because the gospel itself, that's the heart of the gospel in Romans right there in chapter 8. That's why we spent 2 weeks on that. An important part of the context of Romans is the fact that, and we talked about this in the introduction, the church in Rome was made up of both Jews and of Gentiles, but it was primarily Gentiles. And even though it was mostly Gentiles there, probably like 90%, Paul talks a lot about Israel and matters concerning Israel. And that's especially true in the 3-chapter section that we're looking at now, 9, 10, and 11. All 3 of those chapters actually begin with Paul's concern about Israel. Molly talked about chapter 9 last week. I thought she did a great job, by the way. But she talked about election and how even that we have to view in the context of Israel, because that's the context that Paul put it in. I know that can be a really complex talk, or thought. It can be a complex topic, and that was reflected in our groups last week. We had a really fun discussion around that in the groups. But it's a tough topic. How can we be free to choose if we are predetermined, right? So it's hard to get your head around that, and it's totally fine if you don't completely comprehend how all that works yet, but it's inescapable that we are predestined and that we have free will. That is super clear all throughout Scripture. Now, part of the confusion, at least in the modern church, is that we don't understand, and I say we not as individuals, but we as the Western church, we don't understand that election and salvation aren't the same thing, right? That's how a lot of people think about it, but that's clear, right? Israel was elected. Not all of them were saved or are saved, right? So we'll talk about that more as we work our way through these 2 chapters. But chapters 9, 10, and 11 are kind of one section thematically. So today I'm going to talk about both 10 and 11 because I'm going to summarize a lot of it. But, we won't read every word. Wow, that's irritating. They teach you in Bible college, when stuff like that happens, just ignore it. Yeah. I'm not good at ignoring things. My daughter laughs the loudest. So what was I talking about anyway? just kidding. So we're going to cover 10 and 11 this morning. I know it's a lot of ground, but we'll get all the major themes that are being talked about there. And it's really important to recognize that it's about Israel and how that relates to the Gentiles, okay? And the Gentiles are just non-Jewish believers, so who does that include? One person, okay. The rest of you can go now. Anyways, chapter 9 ended with kind of a comparison between the Jews and the Gentiles. If you remember, it talks about how the Gentiles achieved a righteousness that they didn't earn. They didn't do anything for it, but they were viewed as righteous, the Gentile believers. And then it talks about how hard and earnestly the Jews worked for it, but they didn't achieve it because they were pursuing it from a standpoint of self-reliance, right? And then chapter 10 begins with this. Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. So again, there's right at the beginning of all three of these chapters, a concern for Israel. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based in knowledge, since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own self-reliance. They did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. So another important context aspect of the book of, in this series, the book of Romans, is that this is all about the gospel, the good news, the message about Jesus. And we saw that right from the beginning of the letter, how Paul said that he was set apart for the gospel. Remember, that was his purpose. That's his purpose here, is the gospel. And we know from our memory verse, the end of chapter 1, that in the gospel, this is really important, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. Righteousness is an incredibly important theme that's all through the book of Romans. In fact, you see here, just in these two verses, it appears 3 times. And in the book of Romans, it appears 30 times, which is way more than any other New Testament book. If I remember correctly, all of the other New Testament books mention it in the single digits. 30 times it's mentioned in the book of Romans. So righteousness just means that we're in right standing before God, which is the only way you can stand before God. You have to be right with him. Salvation is achieved by being in right standing with God. Now, the Jews thought that they could earn that by following the law. Well, Paul's message in Romans is that basically the law was given to show you that you can't earn it. Nobody can perfectly keep the law. So what's the conclusion of that? We should come to the conclusion that we have to completely rely on God. That's what faith is. It's complete reliance on God. So he actually imparts righteousness to him by the type of faith that completely relies on him. So that's the first, I think, 11 verses of chapter 10. It talks about that, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, like I said, but it would take too long and it would bear little fruit, because he's quoting in that section, all through these sections, he's quoting from the Old Testament. So we could read all that and then explain what he means by bringing up those Old Testament passages, or we can just look at how he explains it and his point by reading all of that. So in verse 9, he summarizes it like this, and you're probably all familiar with this passage. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You will be saved. So that implies righteousness because of everything else Paul says in the letter. The reason that this is such a popular verse is because it's a really brief summary of the gospel, but it does require some understanding, because just saying the words Jesus is Lord does not save you, right? And just believing that he exists doesn't save you, right? Even the devil believes that. Pretty sure he's not saved, right? So it's a certain type of belief that saves you. It's what the Bible calls faith. Faith. And then the confession part of this, if you declare with your mouth, that ties into that, because Jesus said elsewhere, he said, the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. That's key to this, you see, because if you believe in your heart, it's going to come out of your mouth. Jesus is Lord. Those words are an external manifestation of an internal transformation in your beliefs. And it comes out of your mouth. The internal becomes external. That's what that's talking about. It's critical that the internal become external. And he goes into the importance of why it's important for it to come out of your mouth. He says, how then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them, without it coming out of their mouth? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. So this and the Great Commission are the driving force behind all missions work that we do, that the church has ever done. Right? How can they believe unless they hear? How can they hear if it doesn't come out of your mouth? Right? So that's the confession part. It's not only an expression of what's internal, but it's the internal becoming external and having an external impact. So that's why Renovate supports so many different missions efforts that you saw in July during Missions Month. We told you about all the different efforts that this little church is supporting in partnership with Auger Foundation and other situations. So it's also that the seeds of truth can be planted so people have an opportunity to believe. Now, not everyone who hears believes. We all know that, right? Some seeds, Jesus said, fall on rocky soil. Some of it falls on shallow soil and it withers. Some of it falls in among weeds and it gets choked out. But thank God, some of it falls on good soil. And, blessed are the feet. How beautiful are the feet of those who spread that seed of truth, right? So Paul goes on to say that some of his people, Israel, the seed fell on rocky soil. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news. They chose to reject it. For Isaiah says, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. So he's still addressing a mostly Gentile audience about his people, Israel. And maybe you notice in here how much, like I said, Old Testament that he's quoting. He's quoting from Isaiah here. But he doesn't actually always tell you that he's quoting. There's actually 12 Old Testament quotes just in chapter 10. 12 quotes in chapter 10. So he's teaching them, this is an important part of the context, he's teaching them about the old covenant and how that connects to the gospel and how the gospel saves you. Right? He says that faith, the thing that righteousness comes by from first to last, that righteousness that we need from first to last, the thing that saves you, faith. He says it comes by hearing the message about Jesus. Then he says, but I ask, did they not hear? And he's talking about Israel here. Didn't they hear? He says, of course they did. Their voice, I'll explain who there is, their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Whose voice? Their voice. He's actually talking about nature there, because this is another quote. This one's from Psalm 19. And if you read this in context, let's just read the first 4 verses of Psalm 19. Listen to this. The heavens, nature, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal not. That's the there he's talking about, nature. And then he qualifies it. He says, they have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. So he goes, it's not actual words, yet their voice, and this is what he's quoting from, verse 4, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. Did you pick up that this is what he was talking about in Romans chapter 1? In the first chapter, he basically says creation itself is speaking to us about the reality of God, so no one has an excuse. You see that? Did the Jews hear? Of course they did. Then he says, again I ask, did Israel not understand? First Moses said, wait, did Israel not understand? And then he this is pretty brilliant, by the way. He's quoting from Moses, the author of the law that they practically worship, right? He's using their own argument brilliantly to make the point about the gospel. And this is from Deuteronomy 32. I will make you envious by those who are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that has no understanding. So listen, even Moses understood that God's plan always was to reach the hearts of the Gentiles, the Jews and the not Jews, so basically everyone, right? That was always his plan. Now understand, the Jews held the law in really high regard, and the prophets, right? They lived by the law and the prophets. Moses represents the law. Isaiah represents the prophets. So he quotes them again. And Isaiah boldly says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. But concerning Israel, Isaiah says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. Who's he talking about there? Israel. They're disobedient and obstinate. So this is what Jesus meant when he told the parable in Matthew 22 about the wedding banquet. You remember that one? He said there's this king, he has a son, he's getting married, and he put together this elaborate wedding banquet. And then all the people that were invited, he sent out messengers to tell them, it's ready, come and join the banquet, but they didn't come. That's about the Jews. They didn't come. And then he says, so he opened it up to everyone. The good people, the bad people, all of them, come. He's talking about the Gentiles there. So they got to come and party. This elaborate party that they would not normally be able to take part of. But they had to be wearing the wedding clothes. What are that? What's the wedding clothes? It's the righteousness that comes by faith. See that? So first Isaiah's pointing out that the Gentiles found God and they weren't even looking for him, right? Because God revealed himself to them. Then it says his chosen people, Israel, were stubborn and they rebelled. They didn't believe. They didn't come. So Paul asks another question, and that's all of chapter 10. This brings us to chapter 11. He says God's people rejected him, so he asks, did God reject them? They rejected him. Did he reject them? And he says emphatically, by no means. No, he didn't. He says, I'm an Israelite. I'm here serving Jesus. God did not reject those he foreknew. there's that theme. He's still talking in terms of election and predestination here. In fact, he takes it even further. He makes the case for election even deeper. So he's referring back to the story of Elijah that's back in 1 Kings chapter 18 and 19, where Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal. And I'm not stuttering, that's how it's pronounced, Baal. And so he challenged them and he won. Remember the two altars, the God that answers by fire, poured water all over his, and God consumed everything, even the rocks, you know. So he won that competition or that challenge. Yet he still freaked out when Jezebel threatened him, and he ended up throwing this massive pity party, right? He says, they killed your prophets and tore down your altars, wah, wah, wah. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me. Boo-hoo. I'm actually kidding. Any of us would have crumbled under that, you know. But what was God's answer to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed a knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, look at the predestination, the election connotations of all that. And if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. It's unavoidable, right? So he's referring back to a time when the majority of Israel was in absolute rebellion against God. But God chose a remnant in that time to preserve his work through the people of Israel, right? God chose them. And he's saying basically that it's the same way in the present time, right? Israel is still doing the same thing. But there's a remnant. There's a remnant. The church is a remnant. Paul is part of the remnant that God chose, right? Now, since God chose, does that mean that God is working against Paul's will or these other people's will? Does it mean that? Of course not. There's no reason that conclusion has to be reached. It's not a necessary conclusion. In fact, if you look at Philippians, Paul talked about that again. He said it this way. He said, it's God who works in you to will and to act according to his good pleasure. Right? God chose you. He's working in you. Now, since he's working in you, does that mean he's working against our will, our free will? No, it does not mean that. We don't have to come to that conclusion. In fact, if you look at the first part of that sentence, he says, continue to work out your salvation. You continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Well, that means you have the ability to choose to do that or not, right? Why would he say something that you have no power to respond to or do, right? It's not worth saying. So we are chosen, we are predestined, and we are free. It is for freedom that Christ set us free. Galatians 5:1. Now, that does not in any way limit God or somehow negatively affect his sovereignty, his will, his plan, his choice. It does not limit God in any way. Come on, he's smarter than that, right? God knows everything that's going to happen. He knows everything that you will choose. He knows what you're going to do in the future. And actually, that's not even good terminology because it's not the future to God. All time is now to God. He is omnichronological. He exists in the future as much as we and he exists now. He is presently in the past. He had foreknowledge of everything that Israel was going to do, right? And he made provision for it even before they did it. How's that for power? How's that for sovereignty? In fact, in his absolute brilliance, he actually used the stubbornness of Israel to bring in the Gentiles. He works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called to his purpose. So that's covered in verses 11 through 24 of chapter 11. And again, I said I'm not reading all of it. You guys can read it. I'm just summarizing. But Israel's unbelief was a tool that God used to bring the Gentiles to a saving faith. But then Paul warns the Gentiles. This is a cool twist in it. He warns them not to kind of let that go to their heads. And because there's strong evidence that they did. The Roman Gentiles were letting this go to their head. So Paul uses this example of an olive tree. He says, you know, the Jews were the natural branches of this tree, but God had to break them off because of their unbelief. And then he took the Gentiles and he grafted them into the tree. And so they were able to draw up life from the roots, meaning Jesus, right? In verse 20, he says, don't be arrogant. Don't be arrogant. If God did not spare the natural branches, he's not going to spare you either. If you Gentiles fall into unbelief, you'll be broken off. And if the Jews believe, if they come to faith, then they can easily, super easily be grafted back in because that's the tree that they came from in the first place, right? So what is Paul doing here? He's educating the Gentiles about where they fit in God's plan, about exactly what was unfolding before them. Because an important part of this is that before Jesus, it was thought that the Gentiles could not be saved. They weren't the people of God. They could not be saved. And that the Jews were just saved automatically by being Jews. Now, there was qualifications around that and stuff, but that's what they thought. Now, obviously, Paul put that to rest. If you look back at chapter 3, he says, is God the God of only the Jews? Rhetorically, like, that's ridiculous. There's only one God. He's the God of everyone, and everyone is made right before God through faith. You're in right standing with God by simply, completely depending on him. Everybody who believes will be saved, whether you're a Jew or a non-Jew. And like I alluded to, the Roman Gentiles started to think that they were the chosen now. Yeah, the Jews used to be, but, you know, we're Romans, you know, and we're, you know, obviously chosen because, look, you know, Paul's doing all this for us and God's giving us favor and yada, yada. So Paul goes, not so fast. Hold on a minute. The Jews are God's elect to carry my name to the world, right? And if God didn't stay loyal to his covenant with them, why would he be loyal to anyone, right? Paul's defending the integrity of God's covenant to Israel. So, God used Israel's unbelief to bring the Gentiles to saving faith. But get this is really cool. His plan was so powerful. He knows everything. He's so smart that not only did he use Israel's unbelief to reach the Gentiles, he's now using the Gentiles' belief to reach the Jews. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited, right? Not so fast. Don't think you're the chosen now. Israel experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. Wait, what? All Israel will be saved? What does that mean? Does he mean everyone by nationality is going to be saved? No, there's three major ways of thinking about this theologically. There's three possibilities of this, and only three. I guess you can make something up, but theologically speaking, there's really only three possibilities. So first of all, some believe that all Israel, and I believe it's kind of a mixture of all this, but all Israel means the people that he referred to back in chapter 9. Remember, he said, not all descendants of Israel are actually Israel, right? So he's removing what it means to be the people of God. He's redefining that in chapter 9. So some people believe that it's talking about these people, both Jews and Gentiles from all generations, all of those will be saved. I think that's true. But the second belief is that all Israel means ethnic Jews, but he's talking about the remnant that he was just referring to, right? All the ethnic Jews that are the remnant. So it's kind of the Israel version of the full number of the Gentiles. See how he says here, until the full number of the Gentiles has come in? Well, basically, he's saying in this way, the full numbers of all of Israel will come in. You see what I'm saying? And then the third view is that all Israel means ethnic Jews kind of in the final generation. So according to this perspective, the nation of Israel is going to have this final moment where they're all going to turn back to God shortly before or at the second coming of Jesus. Now, those are three options. Maybe they're all true, whatever. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, because the thing that Paul makes absolutely clear in Romans, we've looked at this, is that the Jews are going to be saved in the same way anybody else would be saved. It's by complete reliance on Jesus. So we can just hang on to that if the other part is confusing. All Israel will be saved. Doesn't matter what that means, because that's one spot where it says that, and it's absolutely clear. Everyone will come to saving grace, through grace, by faith. By grace through faith, sorry. By grace through faith, you are made righteous, so you can stand before God. So, hopefully that sheds even more light on this whole predestination thing. I know that's complex, and it's hard to make part of your normal thinking, you know what I mean? Because it's outside of time, it's in time, it's, but that's to be expected. We're talking about God, right? Of course it's incredibly complex. That's how real things are, right? The more complex they are, or the more powerful they are, the more complex they are. There's nothing more powerful than God. So of course it's complex. If you were studying nuclear physics, would you expect that to be easy? Of course not. Of course not. Well, we're talking about the creator of nuclear physics and of everything else in the universe. Of course it's complex. And we're just scratching the surface of God's reality, right? We're just getting little glimpses. We see dimly as in a dirty, old-fashioned, ancient mirror, you know? But isn't this exciting? Isn't it just, it's so powerful. God is so smart. He's sovereign over everything. You know, nothing escapes his view. Nothing escapes his power. Nothing can outsmart him. He's the master chess player who knows the last move even before the first move, right? And that God, who's perfectly good, loves you. He loves you. So what does that mean? It means everything's going to be okay. Now let's really focus on those words. Everything. Everything. Absolutely everything is going to be okay. Because we live in a world where we are literally constantly under threat, right? Natural disasters, the earthquakes that are happening, hurricanes, illness and accidents, evil people who perpetrate their will onto you. Nothing can separate you from the love of God when you're immersed in him, when you're in him, when you're in the kingdom, when you're under the rule and reign of God. Nothing can separate you from his love. So Paul wraps up this whole 3-chapter section, this theme. He wraps it all up, you know, how God can exist in time, yet he transcends it. You know, how he works everything together for our good, how he's got a plan. He's so smart, master chess player, undefeatable, literally undefeatable. He wraps that whole thing up, talking about all that stuff, and he ends it with a kind of doxology of worship. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given anything to God that he should repay them? From him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. Lord, thank you for this powerful, powerful section of Scripture. Thank you for the implications that has on our life, our safety, our future. And God, let all of this soak into our hearts and affect how we think, how we act, our relationships, our priorities, what we put our resources into, what we invest our time in. That God, our walk with you, our participation in your body is not an afterthought of our life. You are the center. You're the center of it all, God. Help us remember that. Help us to live it. And God, as we gather to enjoy this meal, this communion that we'll participate in together, bless the food, but bless our conversation. And have all of it, God. For from him and through him and to him are all things. To you be the glory forever, Lord. Amen. Amen. Stick around for brunch if you can. It's always a fun time. God bless. We're dismissed.